UN talks aimed at agreeing a global treaty on waste plastics have ended without a deal, despite a last-ditch effort overnight. The talks in Geneva had been due to end on Thursday, but countries continued to negotiate into the night. Some oil-producing nations, such as Saudi Arabia and Russia, favour lighter regulation than had been suggested. The European delegation says the talks will act as a good basis for future negotiations. Well, let's speak to our climate and science reporter, Esme Stallard. Esme, this is considered to be a deadlock. Tell us why we've got to this position.
Well, these talks have been going on for more than 2 years now. They were meant to conclude in December. That was the deadline given to countries to come up with a treaty. So this was already into overtime when these talks failed. The main issue is over that issue of production, which you mentioned there. However, we did get a new text overnight around 2 a.m. local time from the chair, which did seem to include some compromise on that issue. So the bloc of almost 100 countries, we're calling them the High Ambition Group, had willingly kind of dropped the language around production in favour of saying that we need to improve the design of plastic in the hope that would reduce our consumption levels, particularly of single use. But despite that, the group of those oil states remained unhappy. They have said they don't think this text is a good basis to go forward for future negotiations. Now, environmental groups have been reacting quite angrily to this. Greenpeace and WWF, I've spoken to this morning, have said they feel like a very small number of nations are dominating and distracting from the key issue in favour of short-term financial gain. Of course, there are expected to be potential economic implications of this treaty for those states. Plastic remains one of the few growth markets for oil as we transition to greener technologies within energy and transport, which means there'll be less demand there.
And what are scientists most concerned about here? You have alluded to it just now, but what's kind of the main sticking points?
I would say there's 3 issues actually. It's the scale of production of plastic. So that's increased exponentially since we first started using synthetic plastics on a big scale around 70 years ago. And that is expected to quadruple out to 2060. The problem is only about 10% of plastics are recycled globally, which means most end up in waste and sometimes not managed properly, so can end up in the environment. Some of those plastics, as they break down, form microplastics. They are really difficult for living organisms to distinguish separately from food and can sometimes end up in the gut or in tissues, which at high concentrations can lead to disease. And then there's the concerns about chemicals. A landmark report from a group of health professionals just before the treaty started said they were gravely concerned about the chemicals within some plastics and the potential risk of being carcinogenic or even endocrine disruptors, which affects your production of hormones, which changes weight levels, for example, and fertility. So they're concerned that any time delay will just increase the amount of waste in the environment and the potential health impacts.
And Esme, what will happen if a deal can't be reached?
That's a great question. So in those final meeting, we heard many countries say that they would like to go to future negotiations, but some countries questioned whether the process was still working. There was a different text earlier on in the negotiations, which was much more aligned with the oil states. They still rejected that, and they think that there's no way that they will come to the table. The alternatives are that they do go to a future negotiation, but it's pushed to a vote. That would be highly unlikely or unusual within an environmental UN process where often things are agreed by consensus. Or the other alternative is there's an agreement done completely outside of the UN process at all.
Esme Stallard, thank you very much for that.